Going. Hello and welcome to And Did Those Feet, the podcast that explores the world of English football from 1945 to 1970. And joining me as ever, hello, Karl Hemsley.
Hello, Peter.
Well, we're going to be discussing English and, in fact, British wingers from their heyday in the 1950s through to their virtual disappearance in the years after the World Cup victory in 1966. The 50s seem to have been a golden age for English wingers, with players like Stanley Matthews and Tom Finney. But I wonder whether these two weren't in some ways, in fact, sort of exceptions to a more general rule that the winger was already in decline in the 50s. And it's the really disappearance of the winger is a sort of inevitable byproduct of. Am I being too negative here?
I don't think you are, Peter. So certainly, if we were to limit it to the players available to England, I think it's a very good point. I think part of the problem is, obviously, you've mentioned the two great wingers who were at the end of the Second World War and pretty much through the 50s, arguably England's finest two players in Matthews and Finney, certainly up there. But the problem is because they were both right wingers, albeit Finney was a much more versatile player. But Finney ended up playing on the left wing because there seemed to have been so few other options. Arguably, England would have been a lot better off if they played Matthews on the right, somebody else on the left, and allowed Finney to play down the middle. But the choices on the left wing, as you're suggesting, were pretty thin, really.
They were. It's a curious thing. I mean, if I tell you that there's a player who played for Wolves who was ever present for England in the 1950 and the 1954 World Cup, I mean, any idea who that might be?
Yeah, that's Jimmy Mullen, isn't it?
That's Jimmy Mullen. Now, that's a very good answer. I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't got it.
Now, I knew he was somebody who'd not got a great many caps, but I did look it up in anticipation of what we'd be talking about, and I saw that he got 12. And I must admit, that's a bit of a mystery to me, because he's somebody who played, 450 games for Wolves, something of that order. From what I can gather, he was a really key part of a great Wolves side over many years.
And wingers were central to the Wolves, to the way the Wolves played.
Yes. So on the face of it, you would think, well, there's your answer. Matthews on the right, Mullen on the left.
Yeah. I
mean, Finney down the middle with depending on, precisely which time you're talking, somebody like Mortensen or Lofthouse. That would be the option. I don't know why Mullen did get so
the games. No, indeed. I mean, and
he's got a lot of goals. He scored a lot of goals for Wolves, and clearly was a very important part in the balance of their side. So it is a strange one. And when you look at the sorts of players who did pick up some caps, you kind of realise that maybe the options beyond Mullen weren't great. There was a great England player who got one England cap on the left wing just after the Second World War, and he played in some wartime internationals. Who am I talking about? And I'll give you a clue.
Yes,
it's a trick question.
Can you give me a club?
He played for Arsenal.
Dennis Compton.
Correct, sir. Yes.
Well, he did play for England, and not just.
So there was a great England international who played on the left wing for England. Just he was great at another sport.
Indeed, yeah, that's true.
So you've got just to throw a few names there. I think to illustrate the point of really what you're saying about the options not being great. Bobby Langton got 11 caps. Les Medley got 6. Billy Elliott got 5. Bill Perry 3. Colin Granger 7.
That's right.
So, just a few examples.
No, I agree.
I think that illustrate the point that
Peter Harris of Portsmouth gets 2 caps. I mean, there's a lot of, you could say that in as far as wingers for England were concerned in the 1950s, many were called, but few were chosen, because there are numerous players here whose names have disappeared from history, if you like. Peter Harris of Portsmouth, George Robb, of course, had his 1 game for England. Plenty of others. Norman Dealey, I don't think we've mentioned, 2 England caps. And so there was evidently, I mean, I think actually, in fact, Alf Ramsey actually perpetuated this himself. I reckon that he gave first caps. Now we're moving forward into the 1960s, and Ramsey becomes England manager in '63. But I reckon he gave first caps to no fewer than 5 different wingers, which is an interesting reflection on the fact that he was not, well, we'll have to look at his motives when we get to that point. Oh, Jack Froggatt, of course, another one, 13 England caps. Now, one thing that struck me about Finney and Matthews is we always talk about Finney and Matthews, or we're quite capable of doing so, as being 2 of a pair, 2 of a kind, if you like. But actually, I think they were quite different from one another in some way. And in particular, as you've hinted, in scoring goals, Matthews has got quite an undistinguished goal scoring record. For England, he tends to score. I've got it here. He's scoring at the rate of about 1 goal every 5 games, 50 matches, 54 caps, 11 goals, and at club level, 1 goal every 10 games. Whereas Finney is scoring at international level, he's scoring over 2 goals per 5 games. So in other words, it's twice as much as Matthews. And for club, it's considerably more. It's 187 goals in 433. So he's scoring over 2 in 5. He's scoring at something like 4 times the rate of Matthews. And I wondered, when I tried to think about what might explain that, just apart from the fact that these 2 are simply different backgrounds, and that might be to do with the times in which they were trained or in which they were schooled in football. And I wondered if the Matthews example, where we've got a goal scorer who's knocking them in at, say, 1 in 10 or somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10, is not a pre-war version of what it is to be a winger. In other words, your job is simply to get down the wing, to get the ball into the centre, to set up the goals, and somebody else will do the scoring. Whereas, by contrast, the Finney example is much more of a post-Second World War, 1940s, 1950s idea, where, everywhere you've got several jobs to do, one of which is putting the ball in the net, as well as providing for others. I mean, Finney seems to have been quite a versatile player in his skills. He seems to have had different, you could say his work was quite diverse in what he was achieving. But Matthews was perhaps more narrow, sort of specific in his approach.
I think they are good examples, because I think it's possible to be a great footballer who's pretty one-dimensional, or you can be a great footballer because you've got such a range of skills. So Gert Muller was a great player, because anybody who scored at his rate would have to be considered a great player. But nobody would argue that he was a great all-rounder, as it were. And Matthews was, in a sense, it seems to me, a great example of a fairly one-dimensional player. He had his one job to do, and he was a great player because he did that one job so brilliantly. Get the cross in. He created so many goals that he was a great player. Finney, on the other hand, was a great player because, in terms of attacking ability, he'd got everything. 2-footed, quick, could shoot, could head, as well as doing the job of beating a man and getting him.
Exactly that. Exactly. Yes, absolutely. He is an elusive player, Finney. He's hard to keep track on, and he's quick. Of course, Matthews is quick. Matthews is quick over a very short distance. So give over sort of as you need to be in football, over 5 yards or something. Matthews is lightning. But is Matthews a little bit one-footed? I wonder if that's a question. In fact, it is often said of Matthews. Of course, he was quite clearly a genius. Nobody can can play first division football at 50 and not be a remarkable footballer. But I think it was said of Matthews, that he couldn't tackle, and actually he wasn't interested in tackling. His view was very clearly. I mean, if you think about Alf Ramsey's aphorism, that when Alf Ramsey goes to Ipswich in the mid-1950s, and they're in the third division, he tells them, we don't have forwards and we don't have defenders, we just have footballers. Whereas I think Matthews' view was very firmly that, that he is a right winger. That's what he does. He wants the ball to feet. Yeah. He'll take on the defender, the opposing fullback. He'll get to the byline. He'll get it into the middle. That's his job done. Don't expect him to tackle back. That's not what he does. And so I think that's a very sort of I think perhaps a pre-war. In fact, I would go further than that. I think that Matthews's commitment to dribbling. He was, after all, the wizard of the dribble, and perhaps that was the excitement that he brought to the team. Was his commitment to dribbling is actually something very traditional in English football. In the early stages of English football, it's said that the English game is a dribbling game, where the Scottish game was a passing game. And
yes.
And I just wonder if Stanley Matthews harks back to a really deep-seated tradition in the English, in particular, when you think that dribbling is now really, I mean, it's a thing of the past, isn't it? Really, in English football, it's hard to think of who recently has been a great dribbler, kind of almost like that. So again, I think it's interesting to think about that idea of Finney being very versatile, able to play right across the front, and Matthews as very specifically interested in dribbling and beating his man, the one-on-one, the thrill that gave the crowd, and then getting the ball into the box and offering the chances to others.
Absolutely, I think you're totally right. But I think one of the things that makes football a great sport is that there's more than one way to skin a cat, and Matthews was still incredibly effective. And in some ways, I wonder whether he not only did he last such a long time, but that he got better for such a long period of time. I was just reading about a game in 1956 when England played Brazil. And this was when Brazil were leading up to having one of their greatest ever sides. And they got Nilton Santos at left back, one of their all-time greats. Matthews was 41 at the time, and by all accounts, completely gave him the runaround. Yeah. England won 4-2. Matthews was involved in all 4 goals.
Oh, amazing! Great start.
And this was the year in which Matthews became the first European Player of the Year. Yeah. And I think I'd got in my head that Matthews won that award almost for what he'd done in his career rather than what he was in 1956.
Yeah.
And there might be something in that, but I don't think it was entirely. I think it really was that he still was phenomenally effective, even at that age.
Oh, that's a really interesting statistic that he has a hand in all 4 goals. And but of course, he doesn't actually score them. He sets them up for others. And one of the things that struck me when I was looking over the statistics for the really impressive, the best wingers of the 1950s, was the extent to which the winger of the 1950s is expected to be able to score goals. And actually, they do score a lot of goals. Now, can I widen the discussion here a little bit to include Scots and Welsh as well? Because we're talking about the English league, aren't we? So if we talk about the English, so we're not now talking about does England produce wingers. We're talking about does the English league expect its wingers to score goals? And to a remarkable extent, the fact is, it does expect that from them. So Tom Finney, as we mentioned, at 400 appearances, nearly 200 goals, astonishing figures for a winger. Billy Liddell of Scotland and Liverpool, who plays right the way through the 1950s, 490 appearances, 215 goals. Again, it's a similar proportion. It's about 2 goals every 5 games from a winger, from somebody who's expected to set up opportunities for others. We mentioned Jimmy Mullen, who's got 98 goals. Jack Froggatt, we mentioned 85 goals, career goals. Bobby Mitchell of Newcastle, 95 goals in his career. Peter Harris of Portsmouth in England, 194 goals in 479 appearances. In other words, again, it's that same proportion again, 2 goals every 5 games. It's a tremendous return for somebody whose job is really to play wide of the centre, to set up goals for other people. And that's the kind of that's a pattern, in fact, that as you go through, as you look at these guys, Brian Douglas of Blackburn Rovers and England, who, by the way, was ever present in the 58 and 62 World Cups, inheritor of Jimmy Mullins. So Brian Douglas and is still with us, by the way, 1934, born 1934. He must be 90 years old. He's got 100 goals in 438 appearances. Cliff Jones of Tottenham and Wales, 207 goals in 511 club matches. Again, it's the same proportion, 2 goals every 5 games. So these are remarkable statistics in a way, aren't they? Because they do show. So if we just go back to our template, our lodestar, which is Matthews, and his rate of scoring, which was 70 goals in 700 games, we're looking at a different role for the winger, I think, in the 1950s. The expectation now is that you can hit the back of the net almost as much as a really successful centre forward. I mean, we expect a really good centre forward to have sort of Michael Owen, Jimmy Greaves type rates of, say, a goal every other game. I mean, that used to be that was until the new normal of Harry Kane and various other excellent players, excellent centre forwards these days. Erling Haaland, for example. It used to be a good goal scorer would get a goal every other game. Well, here we've got wingers who are very nearly matching that, while no doubt at the same time setting up goals for others.
I think you're right. In some ways, it does put me in mind of the modern game, because you're right. There's examples like Kane and Haaland, but there's quite a number of players at the highest level today who kind of are wingers, but clearly expected to score. I mean, Mbappe is a very good example.
Yeah.
But so, for example, Mo Salah.
Yeah.
You know, Liverpool in recent years, it sometimes seemed to me to be the case that it's really the wingers who are more the goal scorer than the centre forward is.
Yeah, interesting.
And you're right. I was looking online at some of the figures of with regards to wingers, and I was really struck by the number of goals scored by the likes of Liddell and Jones. McParland, another one from at Aston Villa. He who scored 5 goals for Northern Ireland at the 1958 World Cup.
Yeah. Was he a winner?
Yes. Yeah. He played on the left wing.
Okay.
Again, I mean, the impression I had for a long period of time, he was Villa's main attacking threat, playing as a winger. You know, he scored both the goals when they beat Manchester United in the '57 Cup final.
Right. Yes.
And yes, as I say, in the '58 World Cup, he was absolutely outstanding. You mentioned Cliff Jones, again, a wonderful player. Again, maybe a little bit like Finney in being very versatile.
Yeah.
In that he played in the double winning side. He played primarily on the right wing, but for most of his career, he played on the left. But it seems to be wherever he was, he scored goals.
I have this image of him attacking down the middle. Actually, I have this image of him attacking through the, of dribbling and being highly elusive and difficult to pin down, and attacking through really what I would call zone 14. That's the area of the pitch with the D. But of course, he was also extremely impressive on the.
I do remember somebody. I can't remember who it was, but somebody old enough to remember Jones properly, but also was the modern game, saying how much Thierry Henry reminded him of Cliff Jones.
That's interesting, because of course he does have a successor at Tottenham right now, which is Son Heung-min, who also attacks from the left, attacks the goal from the left.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. Let's move on from that's our sort of view of 1950s wingers, and let's move on to the man who really did more than anything else to change everything. Who's that? Who do I have in mind?
I think we're talking about Sir Alf.
We are talking about Sir Alf, or then Alf Ramsey. And so let's just quickly recapitulate. He has a very late start to his career because of the war. He gets a game for Southampton, then gets transferred to Spurs and wins the league title 50-51 with Spurs. He gets into the England team and gets something like 33 caps for England. And he's basically an ever-present. He's an automatic choice. He always gets picked. And ahead of him for England, he has Billy Wright as a sort of defensive midfielder, who subsequently gets 100 caps, and ahead of him, Stanley Matthews. And I just wonder if his experience of playing with Stanley Matthews marked Ramsey's view of what a winger should do. Because I think if there's one player that he would not have approved of, and in fact would not have selected, it's Stanley Matthews.
I think that's a really interesting question as to how much Matthews, playing behind Matthews, did influence Ramsey. You know, I think you've really hit on something there. He may well have thought, look, Matthews is the absolute deluxe version of the outright right winger. You know, brilliant at what he does, but how good is that for the team overall? And I think you might be onto something there, that Ramsey thought it's not right to have a player who is so one-dimensional.
It's said that Matthews demanded the ball to his feet. I think Matthews was quite a demanding teammate. Maybe by the time he was a teammate of Alf Ramsey's, he was in his sort of late 30s. He was extremely senior. Yeah. And maybe he felt towards the rest of the team that he, as he said towards Winterbottom, the coach, he wasn't there to be coached. He told Winterbottom, international players don't need to be. I don't think Matthews was the most cooperative of players. No. I can imagine that Ramsey's view of players is that everybody has to muck in every area of the pitch, that attackers have to defend and defenders have to attack.
Well, going there, and this is moving away from wingers a little bit, but I think it supports that point. Of course, the player who Ramsey very famously left out in '66 was, of course, Jimmy Greaves. Played in the group stages, but then didn't play in the knockout rounds of the World Cup. And again, Greaves, clearly a very different player than Matthews, but with the similarity of being a genius, but not an all-round player.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's one thing that Greaves did was put the ball in the net. And I think it was the fact that, I mean, Hurst was quite willing to do the dirty work, to do the hard yards that gave him an edge over Greaves. I mean, actually, if we go back to Ramsey at Ipswich, so let's just to finish the story. Ramsey retires at age about 33. I think the facts are disputed here. From Tottenham, he's hoping for a job on the coaching staff at Tottenham. There isn't a job going. It goes instead to Bill Nicholson, who takes Tottenham to the double, so 1960-61. So there's no doubt they got that decision right. Ramsey gets a job at Ipswich Town, who are in the 3rd Division South, and down the foot of the 3rd Division South. And he then takes on a squad of players who are really have never really been coached, actually, and are somewhat disheartened. And in particular, so there's no teacups with Alf Ramsey. There's no hairdryer. There's just questions which get to the heart of the matter. And he's talking to, and this is, I think, is the key conversation of the whole story of the winger. He's talking to Jimmy Ledbetter, who's a Scottish.
Yes. I'm just waiting for that name to crop up, Peter.
It's a seminal conversation. He says to Ledbetter, why don't you try playing on the wing? So Ledbetter is an inside forward. Why don't you try playing on the wing, says Ledbetter, because I haven't got the right amount of pace to play on the wing. Says Ramsey, but if you play from somewhere around the halfway line, and if with your, because apparently Ledbetter was a brilliantly accurate passer of the ball, and if you really are looking for a diagonal kind of a ball into our forwards from somewhere, really effectively becoming a deep-lying winger, a different kind of winger altogether, no need to beat anybody, thinking of Matthews again, no need to dribble anywhere, no need to get to the byline, but with your accurate passing to bring our forwards into the game, then we really have got the opposition unsure who to mark, unsure how to tackle you, how to mark you, because their fullbacks won't want to come to meet you if you're playing really deep, but at the same time you're playing the ball into the space in front of the forwards, then something can really, take off here. And Ledbetter stays with Ramsey, stays with Ipswich right the way through this extraordinary sequence of events where Ramsey wins the third division title, the second division title, gets promoted to the first division. They're favourites to go down, but they win the first division. And Jimmy Ledbetter is one of only 5 players, all Ipswich players, who have medals for the third division, the second division, and the first division. And he becomes, therefore, kind of different kind of winger, really. Not a winger that needs to get to the byline, not a winger that needs to even get near his fullback, because he's playing the game from 30, 40, 50 yards away from there.
Yeah.
Extraordinary story. And
you might argue he's the Scot who helped England to win the World Cup.
Yeah, indeed. So I think Alf Ramsey is central to this process, and the way that he deals with Ledbetter is such an interesting. But then he comes to when he comes to be England manager. So 1963, he's won the league title with Ipswich. He can't do more with them. He comes to be England manager, and so let's look then at the story of the winger in Ramsey's England team. And it's not that he doesn't pick wingers, is it? In fact, he picks quite a few.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's just this idea of the wingless wonders is there's obviously truth in it because of how England ended up playing. But he had 3 genuine wingers in that squad, didn't he?
He did, and he played them all.
And who were all given a game.
They were. Furthermore, I think one statistic I've found is that he gives first caps to no fewer than 5 different wingers. So he is looking throughout these sort of mid-60s, I suppose. So we've got players like Derek Temple of Everton, who's a winger who gets a first cap with Alf Ramsey as manager. Gordon Harris of Burnley gets his first cap, his only cap as it turns out, with Alf Ramsey as manager. And so it's not as if he won't pick wingers. Well, what is it then? What's going on there?
Well, I think maybe what was going on is that Ramsey thought that the best way to beat the opposition in the group stages, who were good sides but not the best sides, was to have a winger. But that once England were in the knockout stages and were up against sides who were the other potential winners of the tournament, at that point, he didn't want to use wingers and he wanted to revert to the system that he tried out a year earlier away to Spain.
Now, this is a crucial game.
When England had played so very well without wingers. So I don't think it was that he was opposed to wingers. Oh, he clearly wasn't. But that I think from the off in the World Cup, he had the idea that no wingers against the toughest opponents was the way forward.
Do you not think
in those group games he could play one?
Do you not think there was an element of disguise about the way Ramsey played this? The Spain game, we've talked about this game before as being a really seminal match in the run up to the World '66 World Cup, because it's here that Ramsey finds his mojo, isn't it? Here he discovers he kind of stumbles across the kind of the way he wants to play. Just remind us a bit about what happened in that match. Away to Spain, November 65, perhaps somewhere around there, autumn 65.
I must admit, I can't remember the month. I know it was in 65. And I must admit, I've forgotten the score, but I do remember that England
won. 2-0. They win 2-0.
Was it 2-0? England, but that England did play exceptionally well. And I remember quite some time ago reading a book by Bobby Charlton, no doubt ghost written, but I'm sure it was Charlton's view, that game really was of great importance. And that Charlton's view matches with what you were just saying, Peter, that Ramsey wanted to sort of hide that tactic away. Right, I've tried it. It really works. I don't want to give too much away.
That's my suspicion. Yeah, that's my bet. They win 2-0.
The likes of I mean, obviously he didn't know necessarily who he'd be playing in the knockout stages,
No.
but that he didn't want the likes of Argentina, Brazil, Italy, Portugal, the sides who he would expect to be the biggest threats. He didn't want them to have too much of a look at Plan A.
No, I think that's right. England went 2-0, but it could have been 4, it could have been more. The game ends or the second half at least progresses with the sound of the Spanish crowd applauding what the English team are doing. It's to do with where the English team have got their players and what effective use is made of them. Ramsey apparently, I mean, after the game, the celebrations continue long into the night, and including Ramsey, who didn't mind a drink, but he didn't ever get particularly plastered. Well, he got plastered this night apparently, but he put it away, in my opinion, that experience, and he glossed it out again. And if you think that the wingless wonders, therefore, actually they only take, I think, really up to the winning of the World Cup, they've only had 3 games. That is away to Spain, and then the quarterfinal against Argentina and semi-final against Portugal. Those are the 3 games before he reaches the final. And actually, I think I agree with you that leaving Jimmy Greaves out from the final, though controversial and no doubt difficult, was surely absolutely the right thing to do. We're running short of time, so let's just move on a little bit to I mean, it is quite clear, it seems to me, that he has the option to play wingers. He's got 3 wingers in his squad, and he gives them all a game. None of them really come off, do they? John Kennelly in the first game lives to regret. Well, actually, it's his last cap. He lives to regret the fact that he has an ineffectual performance there. And Ramsey, of course, goes on to live out the prediction that he makes in '63, which is that England will win the World Cup. One thing that struck me about the English game in the league game now, I'm thinking about, in the 1960s, is, I don't know if you noticed this, Karl, but the number of players who, I noticed this growing up, who seem to have had a previous life as in a different position. And it struck me that there are lots of players in the 1960s who had previously
yes, I mean, a really good example. One of the other wingers in '66 was Ian Callaghan.
It is a very good example. Ian Callaghan is a great example.
And who ended up being a terrific central midfielder.
Exactly that.
And he must have one of the strangest, in my opinion, of all England careers, because he holds the record for the biggest gap between caps.
Yes. 12 years.
His second cap was in the '66 World Cup.
It was.
And his third cap was in 1977.
It's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary.
By the time he was a midfielder, he won everything that could be won with Liverpool, including being Footballer of the Year. But yeah, I say he was a midfielder. And so what this does really put me in mind of is something I read once from Eamon Dunphy, who wrote a biography of Matt Busby. And Dunphy was a young player at United, and he was convinced that Busby had a spell of time, maybe not surprisingly, maybe the after effects of Munich, where Dunphy thought that Busby's judgment wasn't what it had been and what it became later. And he used as evidence that around about 1963, United's 2 wingers were Bobby Charlton on the left wing,
yes,
and John Giles on the right.
Yes, Johnny Giles, yes, he's a conversion too, yes.
And as Dunphy said, in Dunphy's opinion, the 2 best midfielders in British football in that era.
Yeah, well,
one on the right wing and one on the left.
You're absolutely right. There were plenty of other examples. Billy Bremner, I think, was a right winger before he became a very combative midfielder. Terry Cooper was a left winger before he became a fullback. Cyril Knowles of Tottenham was a left winger before he became a left back. An overlapping, counter-attacking left back. You can see the point. And in fact, I think that tradition continues to this day. Who did England play as their right wing back in the recently completed tournament? It was Saka, wasn't it?
Saka, right, yeah.
Who was actually a winger, really speaking, but a goal-scoring winger, of course. But nevertheless, but there were plenty of other conversions as well. I mean, Bobby Charlton is a good example. I think George Best was an example. George Best played really through the middle, through the last half of his career.
That's right.
Having once turned fullback's blood inside out, as the phrase was. George Best was really more likely to attack down the middle, I would say, by the end of his career. But yeah, it was an extraordinary fact, really, that so many players. It wasn't true of all Franny Lee, by the way. Franny Lee was also right winger.
That's right.
Who became a centre forward, and it seems to me that these are players who were trained in one position, but then found that position was disappearing, and
I wonder if one player that strikes me as maybe the exception that proves your rule there was the Celtic player Jimmy Johnston.
Yeah.
Who was maybe was a throwback of somebody who really was a winger.
Well, I think the Celtic fringe.
Never anything else.
No, you're absolutely right, and he didn't score many goals either, which is contradicts sort of my theory that modern wingers have to score goals. But I think the Celtic fringe is perhaps is a bit exceptional in this case. I was wondering who are the two most recent players who have been really excellent wingers, both Welsh, I think. One of whom played for Manchester United, and one of whom played for Real Madrid, and I think that those two are kind of old-fashioned wingers in that sense. Little bit of a throwback altogether. I wanted to just finish really as we're running out of time now with two interesting footnotes. And perhaps then you can come in with anything that strikes you from what I say. The first is this: the 1958 and 62 World Cups were dominated by Brazil. And their best player was Garrincha, and Garrincha was a winger, an out-and-out winger. And for Ramsey in '63 to say we will win the World Cup, but we won't, he said this, but nevertheless he must have had the plan in mind. We will have we won't really intend to use wingers in the conventional way. That was quite a brave thing to do, given that the World Cup had just been dominated really by Garrincha, by a winger. Ramsey was dispensing with that option.